7 men passed her over that night, and Hattie Doyle counted every one. She stood against the back wall of the Grange Hall in her one good dress, while the fiddles sawed and the lamplight swung, and she watched the men of Dry Fork move through the room the way buyers move through a stock pen. And not one of them stopped for her. She had known most of them her whole life. She had brought them coffee at the church suppers and sat up with their sick children and washed their dead for burying when no one else would, and now they crossed the floor toward younger women, prettier women, women who came with a father's cattle or an uncle's good bottom land, and they let their eyes slide past Hattie Doyle as if she were a coat someone had left on a peg. She kept her chin level and her hands folded, and she did not let her face show a thing, because she had learned a long time ago that the only dignity a poor widow gets to keep is the dignity she refuses to hand over. It was the harvest social, and everyone in the county understood what the harvest social truly was, whatever the church ladies called it. It was a market. Out here a woman alone did not last a winter, and a man without a wife did not last many more, and so every fall before the snow shut the passes, the unspoken business of the frontier got done in a lamplit hall with cider and fiddle music laid over the top of it like a clean cloth over a rough table. Matches were made, arrangements were struck, and the ones nobody wanted were left standing at the wall to watch, and to learn once again exactly where they ranked. Hattie was 26, which in Dry Fork was old for an unclaimed woman, and she was a widow, which was worse, and she was a widow in debt, which was worst of all. Tom Doyle had brought her out from Missouri 4 years back, with a wagon full of hope and a claim up on the dry side of the valley, and Tom Doyle had died of a fever their second winter and left her the claim, the debt he'd taken against it, and a name the town had quietly decided was bad luck to be near. Folks did not say it to her face. Folks out here were too mannerly for that. But she heard it in the pauses, saw it in the careful way the women smiled, felt it in the 7 backs that turned from her that night, one after another, each one a small clean cut she did not let herself flinch from. The first was Walt Hensley, who ran good cattle down on the flats and had buried his own wife the spring before. He came at her sideways, hat in his big hands, wearing the braced look of a man doing a chore he'd argued himself into. He asked after her health. He asked after her claim. And when she told him plain that the claim carried a note against it, she watched the arithmetic move behind his eyes and settle, and he said something about needing a woman who could bring a little something to build on. And he wished her well, and he went and danced with the Pruitt girl who was 19 and came with 40 head. The second man didn't get through a full sentence once he heard her name. The third talked at her a good while about seed corn and river bottom before he allowed, gentle as you please, that he couldn't take on another man's debt along with a wife. The fourth only spoke to her father-in-law across the room and then thought better of the whole thing and never crossed to her at all. By the 5th she had stopped hoping. By the 7th she had stopped counting out loud in her head and had begun instead the older, quieter work of getting through it, of standing straight and breathing even and telling herself, the way she had told herself at Tom's grave, that she had survived worse than a roomful of men deciding she was too much trouble to love. Don't you cry, she told herself. Not here, not in front of the whole town. You've given them everything else. You will not give them that. She was so busy holding herself together that she did not notice the room go quiet until it had already gone quiet. The fiddle scraped and died. The talk fell off in a spreading hush, table by table, until the only sound in the Grange Hall was the wind worrying the door and the lamps ticking on their chains. Hattie lifted her eyes. A man stood in the doorway, and the cold came in around him like it was following him home. He was tall and lean and worn down to rawhide, and he wore a long trail duster gone black with weather, and a low-crowned hat pulled down against the night, and there was dried blood on his sleeve that was not his own, and dust ground so deep into him that he seemed made of the country itself. He had a hard, scarred face and pale eyes the color of river ice under cloud, and he carried a gun low on his hip, the way men carry a thing they have used and would use again without much conversation about it. Every soul in that hall knew him, and every soul in that hall was afraid of him, and Hattie watched a whole room full of people who had turned their backs on her a minute before now find something very interesting to look at in their own cider cups. Because this was Gage. Nobody in Dry Fork used more of his name than that, if there was more, and nobody asked. He had come into the high country 3 years back and taken up the hard broken ground along the rimrock that no sane man wanted, the steep benchland with the killing winters and the good cold water, and he ran horses and a few cattle up there alone, and came down to town maybe 4 times a year for powder and salt and coffee, and left again before dark. There were stories. There were always stories about a man like that he'd been a shootist down in the nations, that there were graves behind him with his work in them, that he'd killed a man in Cheyenne and 3 in Texas, and that the law in 2 territories had decided it was cheaper to leave him be up on his rock than to go up after him. Whether the stories were true, Hattie couldn't have said. What she could see was that the whole town believed them, and that the whole town, gathered here to trade daughters and widows like good weather, had gone silent and small the instant this one hard man filled the door. He did not look at the pretty girls near the center of the room. He did not look at the fathers by the cider barrel or the church ladies at the pie tables. His pale eyes went slow around the hall, unhurried, reading it the way he'd read weather or sign, and they came at last to the back wall, to the plain widow in the mended dress, standing alone with her chin up and her hands folded, and her whole ruined evening held together by nothing but her own stubborn spine. And they stopped on her, and they stayed. Hattie did not look away. She could not have said why. Everyone else in that room was studying the floor, and here she was staring straight back into the coldest pair of eyes in the territory, and finding, underneath the cold, something she had not expected and could not yet name. Not cruelty, something more like recognition, the look of a person who has spent a long time being the one nobody wants near, meeting another one across a crowded room, and knowing her on sight. Gage crossed the floor. He crossed it slow and straight, and the crowd opened in front of him and closed behind him, and the closer he came, the harder Hattie's heart went. But she held her ground, because running was one more thing she had decided years ago she would not do in front of these people. He stopped an arm's length from her. Up close he was even more weathered, a web of old scars along his jaw, a coldness to him that was not put on. He smelled of horse and pine smoke and the long trail. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough and quiet, pitched for her and not for the room, though the room was straining to hear. "They've been walking past you all night," he said. It was not a question, so she did not answer it. She only looked at him. "I've been standing in that door 10 minutes watching it," Gage said. 7 of them. I counted. Something moved far back in the pale eyes, something that in a warmer man might have been anger. "Not one of them's fit to carry your water." Hattie's breath caught. In 4 years in Dry Fork, no one had said a kind word about her worth that did not come wrapped in pity, and this was not pity, and it was not soft, and it landed somewhere in her that had gone a long time untouched. "I don't know what you're about, mister," she managed, keeping her voice even the way she'd kept it even all night, "but I've had about all the being looked at I can stand for one evening. Then I'll be plain and quick." He turned his hat once in his scarred hands, the only unsure thing about him. I've got hard ground up on the rimrock and good water and more work than one man can hold, and I've had my fill of holding it alone. I don't need a woman who'll bring me cattle. I've got no use for a soft one who'll run home to her people the first bad winter. I need one who'll stand. And I've been watching you stand against that wall for an hour, taking what this town's been handing you without once bending, and that's the only thing I ever saw in a person worth having. The ice eyes held hers. Your name's Doyle. You've got a claim you can't pay for, and a town that's decided you're bad luck. I'll take the note off your back, and I'll marry you honest, and I'll never once lie to you as long as I live. That's the whole of the offer. You can slap me for it if you like. The hall had gone so quiet Hattie could hear her own blood. 7 men had looked her over that night and walked away, and now the one man in the territory they were all afraid of had crossed the whole room to stand in front of the one woman they'd all refused, and he had chosen her, only her, in front of every last one of them. She did not slap him. She married him. She thought about it a long moment first, standing there with the whole town holding its breath, and what she thought was not romantic, and she knew it. She thought about the note on her claim that came due at the bank in the spring, and the winter with no wood cut and no meat laid by, and the particular sound of a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth. And she thought about the hard truth underneath the man's hard offer, which was that he had not lied to her, not softened one word of it, and that in 26 years of being handed pretty words that meant nothing, she had never once been handed a plain one that meant exactly what it said. She looked into those cold eyes and found no warmth there and no cruelty either, only an honesty as bare and level as the ground he'd offered her. And she decided, below thinking, the way she'd decided the important things her whole life, that she would rather walk up a mountain toward an uncertain truth than spend one more night with her back against a wall of comfortable lies. I'll want it in writing, she said. The note paid, and my name on the partnership same as yours. I've been somebody's charity, and I've been somebody's burden, and I won't be either one again. Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of Gage's hard mouth and was gone. Half share, he said. Filed proper at the county. I'd have offered it if you hadn't asked. A woman who won't ask for what she's owed isn't worth much up on that rock. They were married 3 days later in the front room of the parson's house, with the parson's wife and the county clerk for witnesses. And it was nothing like a wedding, and both of them knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which was its own kind of honesty. Gage paid the note at the bank that same morning, counting out coin from a poke-heavy with the color of a man who had dug or won or taken his money the hard way, and the banker took it without meeting his eyes. And that afternoon, Hattie Doyle, who was Hattie Gage now, on a paper filed at the county, climbed up beside her new husband on the seat of a hard wagon and rode up out of Dry Fork toward the rimrock, and she did not look back at the town that had watched her go, because there was nothing back there she wanted, and everything she had left in the world was the trunk at her feet and the cold man. Beside her and whatever the two of them could build out of hard ground and harder weather, the rimrock country took the better part of a day to climb into, and it got wilder and higher and lonelier with every mile. The valley farms fell away below them. The road became a track, and the track became a trace, switching up through black timber and across shale slides where the wagon wheels skittered, and Gage put a steadying hand out without a word, and out onto high, open benchland where the wind never fully stopped, and the grass grew short and tough and silver, and the mountains stood up close and white-capped and did not care one way or the other whether a person lived or died among them. It was a hard country. It was also, Hattie thought, watching the light come gold and slanting across those endless benches. the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and something in her that had been folded up small and careful for 4 years began, cautiously, to breathe. His place was a low, strong cabin of squared logs set back against a rimrock wall for shelter, with a good pole corral and a run of horses in it, and a spring that came up clear and cold out of the rock and never froze all the way down, even in the worst of it. That spring, she would learn, was the whole reason for everything. In a high country that went dry and killing in a hard winter, water that ran all year was worth more than gold, and men had died over less, and one man in particular had already begun to want it. But that came later. That first night Gage carried her trunk inside and set it down, and stood a moment in the middle of his own hard-won room, looking suddenly at a loss. A dangerous man who had faced down whole towns and did not seem to know what to do with a woman standing by his fire. The cabin was spare and clean and entirely a man's, a bunk and a table and a rack of guns and one tin cup on the shelf. "It's rough," he said. "I never had cause to make it more than it needed to be." Hattie set down her shawl and looked around at the bare, strong room and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something ease in her chest. Here was a place that had no use at all for the things she didn't have, the beauty and the dowry and the soft graces, and every use in the world for the things she did, the strong back and the steady hands and the will that would not break. "It'll do," she said. "It'll do just fine." And she meant it more than she'd meant anything since Tom Doyle died. The life up there was harder than any she had known, and she had known hard, and it made her, day by day, into something she had not been before. Gage was up and gone before first light most mornings, out to the horses or the cattle or the far fence in the blue cold. And by the time Hattie had the fire going, he'd already put in half a day's work. He was a hard teacher, but not a cruel one, which she came to understand was rare, and which she came to value more than any tenderness. He did not mock her when she failed. He did not lose his patience out loud. He simply showed her a thing once, plain and complete, and then let the mountain teach her the rest. Because the mountain was relentless and did not take a day off, and neither, therefore, could they. He taught her to sit a horse and then to truly ride one, to throw a rope and then to catch with it, to load and level and fire the rifle until her shoulder bruised and then healed and then stopped bruising. He taught her to read the sky for the storms that came down in an hour, to doctor a horse's foot and pull a calf, and know from the set of the clouds whether they had a day to get the hay in or only an afternoon. And she learned. She learned fast, faster than he expected, and though he was a man who spent his praise like it cost him coin, now and then he'd watch her do a thing right that she'd done wrong a week before. And he'd say, "You learn quick," in a flat tone she came to understand was, from him, something close to wonder. She never made a fuss over it. She could tell that not making a fuss was itself a thing he prized, that he had chosen her in part because she was a woman who could take a hard truth or a rare kindness with the same level steadiness and give him quiet where another woman would have given him chatter. They did not talk much those first weeks, but the quiet between them was not empty. It was the particular full quiet of two people who had each spent a long time entirely alone learning, slowly and with difficulty, how to be alone together. The one thing he gave without being asked was the truth. He never once softened a thing for her, never once told her a comfortable lie, and she came to understand that honesty was the whole language between them, the only currency either of them trusted. When she asked him plain, one night by the fire, why the town feared him, he did not dodge it. "Because I've killed men," he said, looking into the fire. "4 that I'll own to, more that I won't discuss. I was a hard young fool with a fast hand, and I hired it out to hard men for hard money down in the nations and in Texas, and I did things a man doesn't wash off. He turned the tin cup slow in his scarred fingers. I came up here to be done with it, to hold one clean thing before I die. This ground, that water, these horses. That's all I'm about now. But a man's name follows him like a dog, and mine's got teeth, and I won't tell you it doesn't. You married a man half the territory would cross the street to avoid. You ought to know exactly what you married. Hattie looked at him a while. She thought about the 7 men in the Grange Hall who had walked away from her clean and respectable and kind, and about this scarred killer who had crossed the whole floor to choose her and had not lied to her once since. I know what I married, she said. I married the only man in that hall who told me the truth. The horse they called the Black Devil was the making of her. Though it near killed them both first, Gage had brought him up off the open range that fall, a big black stud with a walleye and a hatred of men bred into him by whatever hard handling had come before, and everyone who knew horses said the animal was ruined and ought to be shot, and Gage said the animal was the best blood he'd ever seen and would throw 100 good colts if a person could only reach him. For 2 weeks the black threw him, slammed him into the corral rails, struck at him with iron front feet, and Gage came in each evening bruised and silent and went out each dawn to try again, because that was the kind of man he was, and Hattie watched and said nothing, because she was learning the kind of woman the mountain was making her. It was on a gray morning near the first snow that the black caught him wrong. Hattie was at the cabin window when she saw it, saw the stud rear and come down, and Gage go under, saw the front hooves strike, and her husband roll and not roll fast enough. She was out the door and across the yard before she knew she'd moved. And she did the thing she had watched him do and had practiced in secret against exactly such a day. She came in low and sure and got a hand on the hackamore and put her whole weight and her whole will against the animal, talking low and steady the way Gage talked low and steady, not afraid, or afraid and past it, until the black stopped fighting her and stood trembling and blowing and let her lead him off the fallen man. Gage got up slow, holding his ribs, and looked at his wife standing there holding the horse that no one could hold. The ruined killer stud gentled at the end of her arm with its ears coming forward, and he looked at it a long moment. He wouldn't stand for me, Gage said. 5 years I've handled horses, and that one never once stood for me. Something worked in the hard, scarred face. He stood for you. I asked him nicer than you did, Hattie said, and she saw it happen, saw the thing far back in the cold eyes crack open just a little, and Gage laughed. It came out rusty and startled, like a sound he'd forgotten he owned, and it was the first time she had heard it, and she thought it might be the finest thing she had earned in her whole hard life, finer than any man's dance at any Grange Hall, that she had made this Iron Man laugh out loud on a gray morning under the first snow. After that something changed between them, quiet and unspoken and real. The black gentled to her hand and no other, and she took over his breaking, and Gage watched her do it with a still open wonder he no longer troubled to hide. In the evenings now they talked. He told her about the nations in Texas, the bad years, laying it out flat without excusing any of it. She told him about Missouri and Tom Doyle and the 4 years of being the town's bad luck, and he listened the way he did everything, complete and unhurried, and did not offer her pity, which was the one gift she could not have borne, and offered her instead the plain respect of a man taking the measure of what another person had survived and finding it considerable. They were not soft with each other. Neither of them had a soft place left to reach from. But they were true with each other, and Hattie was discovering that true, when you have gone your whole life without it, is worth 10 of soft. The summer taught her something the winter couldn't, and it taught it to both of them at once. On the night, The bench caught fire. It came the way the worst things on the high country came, without warning and without mercy. A dry lightning storm walked across the mountains one evening in late July, all flash and no rain, and one of those cold white bolts struck the tinder dry grass on the far end of the bench, and by the time Hattie saw the orange line of it crawling along the ground in the dusk, it had a quarter-mile of head start and a rising night wind behind it, driving it straight toward the corral and the cabin and everything the two of them had. Gage was already running for the horses. Hattie was already running for the wet sacks and the shovels, because a whole summer of the mountain had taught her that when the fire comes, you do not stop to be afraid of it. You meet it, and you meet it fast. There was no time to think and no time to talk, and they did not need to, and that was the thing Hattie would remember afterward. They had become, without either of them naming it, two halves of one working animal. Gage cut the horses loose and hazed them off toward the safe rock, while Hattie ran a wet burlap sack along the fire's edge, beating it, smothering it, choking it down foot by foot. And when the wind gusted and threw a wall of flame past her too fast to beat, she did the thing she'd watched him do to a grass fire back in the spring. She took a burning brand and started her own small fire ahead of the big one and let it burn back toward the wall of orange, so the two fires met on ground already black and starved each other out. Backfiring, he'd called it. Fighting fire with fire. She had watched him do it once and filed it away the way she filed everything away up here, against the day she'd need it, and here was the day, and she needed it. And it worked. They fought that fire the whole short summer night, side by side and back to back, black to the elbows with soot and streaming sweat in the heat of it. And there were two separate moments Hattie was sure they'd lost the cabin, and both times it was the work of the two of them together, his strength and her quickness, his knowing and her nerve, that turned it in the last 30 feet. By the gray of dawn the fire was out. The bench was a black, smoking ruin for half a mile, but the corral stood, and the cabin stood, and the spring ran on untouched in its rock, and Gage and Hattie sat down in the burned grass right where they were, too spent to walk the last 100 yards home, and looked at what they'd saved. Most folks would have grabbed what they could carry and run for it, Gage said. His voice was a rasp from the smoke. He was looking at her, at the soot on her face and the burns on her hands and the fierce spent life in her eyes. Any sense at all, that's what they'd have done. Cut the horses and run, and let the rest burn. I've done my running, Hattie said. I ran from Missouri, and I ran from the whole town's pity for 4 years, and I'm done with it. This is mine now. You don't run from what's yours. You stand in front of it with a wet sack, and you fight. She looked at the black ground and the standing cabin, and, past it, the first pale light coming up gold over the burned bench. Besides, I've never in my life had a thing worth staying for. I wasn't about to let it burn the first summer I found one. Gage was quiet a long moment. Then he reached over, in the ash and the dawn light, and took her burned hand in his scarred one, careful of the raw places, and he held it, and he did not say anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the holding didn't say better. And Hattie sat in the burned grass with her hand in her husband's hand, and understood that somewhere in the smoke and the long night they had crossed over into something. Not the soft thing the fiddle music at the Grange Hall had promised all those women, something harder and truer and better. They had become partners in the deepest meaning of the word, two people who had proven to each other, in fire, that neither one would run. It was the water that brought the trouble, the way Gage had always known it would. His name was Silas Meade, and he owned the Bar M down on the flats and most of the paper in Dry Fork besides, and he ran more cattle than his own range could water in a dry year, and for 3 years he had wanted the cold all-season spring that came up out of the rimrock on Gage's high ground. He'd sent word before, offers, and Gage had turned them all down flat. But that winter came in hard and dry. The low creeks froze to the gravel, and Silas Meade's thirst for that mountain water sharpened into something that stopped bothering to be polite. He rode up himself in December, on a fine tall horse, with 3 of his men strung out behind him, and he sat in the yard and looked down at Gage and at the plain woman beside him, with the cold, false courtesy of a man who has bought most of the things he's ever wanted and expects to buy the rest. "Heard you took a wife, Gage," he said. "Heard it was the Doyle widow, the one nobody in town would have." His gaze moved over Hattie, dismissing her the way the whole town had dismissed her, and she looked back at him level and unmoved, because she had stood against worse than Silas Meade in that Grange hall and had not bent. "I'll come to it plain. That spring of yours is bleeding good water into rock, while my cattle die of thirst 4 miles down the mountain. I've been patient. I've been generous. My patience is about used up. Sell me the water rights, and I'll make you rich enough to leave this rock. Or don't, and learn how hard a winter can be for a man alone up high with no friends in the valley." He touched his hat brim to Hattie, an insult folded inside a courtesy. "You look like a sensible woman. Talk to your husband." "I've talked to him," Hattie said, before Gage could answer. "We don't sell the water. Not to a man who'd let his neighbor's cattle drink and then hold the drinking over him forever. That's not a trade, Mr. Meade, that's a collar. And we've both of us worn about all the collars we intend to." She heard Gage go still beside her, heard the surprise in his stillness, and she kept her eyes on Meade and her chin up. "Was there anything else?" Silas Meade looked at her a long moment, and the false courtesy went out of his face, and what was left underneath was cold and patient and ugly. "No," he said. "There's nothing else." He turned his fine horse and rode down off the bench with his men behind him, and the last thing he said, half over his shoulder, drifted back to them on the cold wind. "Hard country, Mrs. Gage, hard on folks who won't be reasonable." When they were gone, Gage looked at his wife for a long while. "That was my fight," he said. "You didn't have to step into it. It's my water, too. My name's on the paper, same as yours." She met his eyes. "You told me a woman who won't stand up for what she's owed isn't worth much up on this rock." I was listening. And Gage looked at her, at the plain widow no man in Dry Fork had wanted, standing on his hard ground telling a cattle baron where the line was. And the thing far back in the cold eyes was no longer cracked open just a little. It was open all the way. Silas Meade did not send another offer. Men like Silas Meade do not knock twice. The trouble started small, the way that kind of trouble does. A section of Gage's drift fence came down in the night, cut clean, and 40 head of his cattle drifted off the bench and had to be gathered back over 3 hard days. Then a haystack burned, the winter feed that stood between the stock and starvation, and there was no lightning that week to blame it on. Gage said nothing much, but he cleaned his guns at the table now in the evenings, and he took to riding the fence line with the rifle across his saddle bow, and Hattie learned to keep hers by the door. It came to blood in January, on the High South Trail, when Gage rode out at dawn to check the far water and did not come back by dark. Hattie waited 2 hours past the time, and then she stopped telling herself stories about it, and she saddled the Black Devil in the freezing dark and took the rifle and rode out to find her husband. Because there was no one else to do it, and because she had long since become a woman who did the thing that needed doing with the tools she had. She found him 3 miles out on the South Trail in the blue starlight, off his horse and down in the snow against a rock, and for one terrible moment she thought she'd come to find a dead man. But he was alive. He was shot through the side, high, and had been bleeding a long time, and there were 2 sets of horse tracks going away hard down the mountain that told the rest of the story without anyone having to say it. Meade's men, Gage got out through his teeth as she got down to him. 2 of them, laid up in the rocks. I got careless. His pale eyes found her face in the dark. You shouldn't have come out here alone, Hattie. There's men on this mountain tonight that'd hush, she said, already cutting his coat away from the wound with her cold, sure hands. You can scold me for it after you're not dying. Right now, you're going to help me get you on that horse, because I can't lift you, and if you argue with me, I'll leave you here to freeze on principle. She got him up. God knew how, a wounded man near twice her weight, but she got him belly down over the black saddle, and she walked them the 3 miles home through the killing cold, leading the horse, one hand fisted in Gage's coat to hold him on, talking to him the whole way to keep him with her, and when he went quiet, she'd shake him and cuss him until he answered. And she did not let herself feel the cold or the fear or the ache in her until she had him inside and down on the bunk in the firelight where she could see what she was fighting. What she was fighting was the wound, and then the fever that came behind it, which she knew from 100 nights of doctoring stock and one long-ago winter of watching Tom Doyle burn up and die, was the thing that truly killed. Not the bullet. The bullet she cleaned and packed and closed with a needle and thread and a steadiness in her hands she did not feel anywhere else. It was the fever that came on the second night that meant to take him, and she met it the way she had learned to meet everything up on that mountain, head on and without flinching, with cold cloths and willow bark tea and the stubborn refusal to let a living thing die that had been the truest part of her since before she'd had a name for it. She did not sleep for 3 days. She sat by the bunk and cooled him and dosed him and held him down when the fever made him fight, and she talked to him low and steady the way she talked to the black devil. And somewhere in the black middle of the 3rd night, when his skin was afire and his breath came shallow and the odds were as long as they get, she leaned close and said a thing she had not planned to say and had not known was true until she heard herself say it. "Don't you die on me, Elias Gage," she whispered. "I have been left behind by every soul I ever cared for, one way or another, and I did not climb this whole mountain and marry the meanest man in the territory to sit here and watch it happen one more time. You hear me? You are the first true thing I've had in my life, and you do not get to leave. Fight, fight, damn you. I'm not done with you." The fever broke near dawn. She knew it before she touched him, knew it by the change in the quality of his breathing, from the tight, effortful battle of a man fighting something to the loose, easy quiet of a man simply finally sleeping. She put her hand to his forehead and found it cool and damp, and she sat back in the hard chair and felt something in her chest come loose that had been clenched tight as a fist for 3 days, and only then, with the danger past, did Hattie Gage put her face in her scarred hands and let herself weep, once, quietly, for about a minute, before she wiped her face and got up and put the coffee on. He was weak a long time, which galled him, and he did not hide that it galled him. But somewhere in those slow, healing days, something had settled between them that would not come unsettled again. He woke one afternoon to find her asleep in the chair beside him, worn down to nothing from the nursing, and when she opened her eyes he was watching her with a look she had never seen on him, a look with no cold in it, anywhere at all. "You walked me down 3 miles of that trail in the dark," he said, "with Meade's men still up here. You could have been killed a dozen ways." "I've been counting them," Hattie said. "It's a wonder either of us is alive, the way we carry on. Why'd you come after me?" It was not an accusation. It was the question of a man who had spent his whole life being the kind of man nobody comes after, and could not fit the shape of it. You could have stayed to the cabin, held the fort. Sensible thing. Hattie thought about how to say it. She was not a woman for pretty speeches, and neither was he a man for hearing them, so she gave him the plain truth, which was the only coin either of them had ever trusted. "Because you crossed a whole room to choose me when nobody else in the world would," she said. "So I reckoned I'd cross a mountain to keep you. Seems only fair." She got up to see to the fire. "Now hush and rest. There's a cattle baron down the hill who's decided we're in his way, and I've got a feeling we're going to need you back on your feet. He mended slow through the deep of that winter, and in the mending, something in him let go that Hattie had not known was still holding on. She ran the whole of it while he healed, the horses and the cattle, and the fence and the fires and the long cold rounds, and she ran it well, and he watched her do it from the window or the bunk, with a stillness that had no worry left in it. He had spent his whole life certain that if he let go of a thing for one moment it would be lost. And here he was flat on his back for the better part of a month, and nothing was lost, and the not losing worked on him the way water works on stone, slow and total. One night deep in that hard winter, with the wind piled up against the walls and the fire low, he told her the last thing, the thing underneath all the other things, the reason a hard man had come up onto a lonely rock to be done with the world. There had been a woman, once, years back, before the nations, before any of it, and there had been a child coming. And Gage had ridden off to do one more hard job for hard money, one last one, he'd told her, enough to buy them a clean start, and while he was gone, the sickness had come through and taken them both, the woman and the unborn child, and he had come riding home with his blood money to a cabin with 2 graves behind it and no one left alive to spend it on. He had not built anything since. He had not let himself want anything he could lose, until a cold November night in a Grange hall, when he'd stood in a doorway and watched a woman take the whole town's contempt without bending, and had thought, against every hard lesson he'd ever learned, there, that one, that's a thing worth the risk of losing. Hattie listened to all of it in the firelight and did not offer him one word of pity, because pity was the one thing that would have broken it, and instead she moved from her chair to sit beside him on the edge of the bunk, and she took his scarred hand, and she said, "Then we're a matched pair, Elias Gage. You lost everything and quit wanting, and I never had anything to lose in the first place. And between the two of us, we ought to be able to build one life that neither of us is afraid of." And he looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached up with his healing arm and touched her face, just once, rough and careful, the way a man touches a thing he has finally decided to let himself believe in, and it was worth more than all the sweet words and all the soft valleys she had never been chosen for. The storm came down out of the north in the last hard days of February, and Silas Meade came up the mountain behind it. He had waited, the way patient greedy men wait, for the one moment the odds ran all his way, and here it was, handed to him by the weather. Gage was still weak from the wound, barely able to cross the cabin without holding the wall. A blizzard was closing the high country down, the kind that shut a man in and killed anything caught out in it. And in the white heart of that storm, when no witness could see and no help could climb, Silas Meade sent 5 riders up the south trail to take the spring by force, to burn the cabin and run off the horses and drive the crippled gunman and his bad luck widow off the rock for good, and to be able to say afterward, if anyone ever asked, that it had been the winter that did it, the way winters do. Hattie saw them coming. She was at the south window in the last gray light before the storm swallowed everything, and she saw the dark line of riders far down the mountain, pushing up into the wind. And she knew, the way you know a thing in your spine before your head has caught up, exactly what they were and why they had come on this night of all nights. She turned from the window. Gage was already trying to get up, already reaching for the wall, his face gone white with the effort, and she saw in one clear, terrible instant how it would go if she let it. The wounded man dragging himself out into the killing cold to make a last hard stand at his own door, and dying there, because that was the only ending a man like Gage knew how to write for himself. "No," she said. "Hattie, no." She was already pulling on his brother's old coat, already taking the rifle down from over the door and filling her pockets with cartridges, moving fast and sure, and her voice when it came was so level and so cold that it stopped him where he stood. "You can't sit a horse and you can barely stand, and if you go out there you'll die in the snow 40 feet from this door. And then they'll have the water and they'll have burned you for nothing. So you're going to stay. You're going to hold this cabin and that rifle by the fire, and if any man gets past me, you'll make him wish he hadn't." She checked the loads with hands that did not shake. "There's one way up onto this bench in a storm, and it's the cut above the south draw, and it's 4 feet wide, with a 100-foot drop off the side. One person who knows this mountain can hold that cut against an army. And I know this mountain." She looked at him. "I've been learning it all winter for exactly this." "They'll kill you," Gage said, and there was a thing in his voice she had never heard there, raw and stripped bare. "Hattie, I have watched everything I ever cared about get taken from me. I can't. Then it's a good thing I'm not yours to lose," she said, gentling for just a moment. "I'm my own. That's the whole point of me, Elias. You didn't marry a thing to keep safe. You married a woman who stands." She pulled the door open on the roaring white. "Now hold the fire, I'll be back." And Hattie Gage went out alone into the blizzard. She rode the Black Devil, because the Black Devil was the only horse on the mountain that would face that wind, and because he was hers the way nothing else had ever been hers, and the two of them went up through the storm to the cut above the south draw, the narrow throat of rock that was the only door onto the high bench. She left the Black in the lee of the rimrock and took her rifle up into the rocks above the cut, where a 100-foot drop guarded her flank, and the 4-foot trail ran below her like the neck of a bottle. And she settled into the snow with the wind screaming and the cold burning in her lungs, and she waited, and she was not afraid. Or she was afraid, and had gone all the way through the far side of it, to the cold, clear country beyond, where there is nothing left but the thing that must be done. They came up out of the white, one at a time, because one at a time was the only way the cut allowed, hunched and half blind in the storm, not looking up, not expecting a soul alive to be waiting for them on such a night. And when the lead rider was full in the throat of the cut, with the drop at his shoulder, Hattie Gage put a rifle bullet into the rock, a foot from his head. The sound of it was enormous, even in the storm. The shot screamed off the stone, and the man's horse reared and near went over the edge, and the rider hauled it back from the drop by main force. And below him the others bunched and shouted and could not see where the shot had come from. "That's far enough." Her voice carried down the wind hard and clear. "This is Gage ground and Doyle water, and you'll not set one more hoof on it tonight." "It's the woman," someone bawled up out of the storm. "It's just the woman. Get up there and—" She shot again. And this time the bullet took the lead man's hat off his head and sent it out over the 100-foot drop into the white, and the man went flat against his horse's neck, and nobody moved. The next one's not a warning. She levered a fresh round, and her voice never rose and never shook, and that was somehow the most frightening thing of all, the flat certainty in it. "I've buried a husband, and I've nursed a shot man, and I've broken a horse no man could touch, and I have got nothing left in this world to be afraid of, and I am up in these rocks where you cannot reach me, and I can hold this cut till spring. Now you tell Silas Meade something for me. You tell him the widow nobody in Dry Fork would have is sitting on his water with a rifle and a clear conscience. and if he wants it, he can come up this trail himself and ask her for it in person. Go on. Get down off my mountain before I stop being neighborly." There was a long silence full of nothing but the storm. And then, down in the white, the riders turned. One by one they backed their horses out of the cut, because there was no way through it that did not run under her gun, and no cattleman's wages were worth dying for on a rock in a blizzard, and they went back down the south trail into the storm they'd come out of, and Hattie Gage held the cut alone until she was certain, past all doubt, that they were gone. Then she rode the Black Devil home through the blizzard, and she came in out of the killing white with ice in her hair and the rifle still warm across her back, and she found her husband on his feet against the wall by the fire where she'd left him, the second rifle in his hands, tears frozen in the creases of his hard, scarred face. A man who had spent his whole life certain that everything he loved would be taken from him in the dark, standing there having learned, at last, that this time it hadn't been. "They're gone," Hattie said. "They won't try that cut again." Gage crossed the room to her, slow and unsteady, and he took her cold face in his two hands. And for a long moment the hardest man in the territory could not say a single word. "I chose you because you'd stand," he finally managed, rough and low. "I didn't know. Hattie, I swear before God I didn't know what I was choosing." "I know," she said, and put her frozen forehead against his chest. "Neither did I." Silas Meade had made one mistake, and it was the mistake that greedy men always make in the end. He had believed that because a thing could not be seen, it had not happened. But 5 men had ridden up a mountain in a blizzard to burn out a wounded man and steal his water. And 5 men had come back down, turned by a lone woman with a rifle. And men talk. They talk in the bunkhouse, and they talk in the saloon, and the story got loose the way stories do, and by spring the whole valley knew that Silas Meade had sent riders in the night to take by force what he couldn't buy, and had been beaten off a rock by the widow the town had thrown away. It did not make Meade feared. It made him small, and a cattle baron can survive being hated, but he cannot survive being small, because his whole power rests on other men believing he is larger than they are, and once they have seen him turned back by a woman in a storm, they stop believing it. The dry years finished what the blizzard started. 2 hard summers came down on the valley one after the other, the low creeks failing, the flats burning brown, Silas Meade's great thirsty herd dying by the score around waterholes gone to cracked mud. And up on the rimrock, cold and steady and indifferent to all of it, the spring came up out of the rock and ran on the way it had run for 1,000 years. All season, every season, the most valuable water in the county. And it belonged, filed proper at the courthouse with 2 names on the paper, to Elias Gage and to Hattie Doyle. They did not do with it what Silas Meade would have done. That was the difference, and the whole valley came to understand it. The small outfits that were honest, the families going under in the drought, the Pruitts and the Hendersons and a dozen more, Hattie let them drive their stock up to the high water and drink it free through the worst of the dry, and asked nothing for it but that they remember who had opened the gate when the man down the mountain had only ever wanted to lock it. But to Silas Meade, who came at last in the second dry summer, humbled and desperate, his herd dying, and offered real money now, offered anything. For the water he'd once tried to steal, Hattie Gage said no. She said it standing on her own porch, level and cold, and entirely without cruelty, and she said it in front of witnesses, so that it would travel. "You had a chance to be a neighbor to this valley, Mr. Meade," she told him. "You chose to be its master instead, and when I wouldn't hand you the collar, you sent men up my mountain in the dark to burn me out. So here's my answer, and you can carry it back down the hill with you. Every honest man in this valley can water his stock at my spring for the asking. You can watch your cattle die of thirst 4 miles from water and think about the difference between the two. That's not me being hard, Miss Mead, that's just the country. You always did like to remind folks how hard the country was. Well, it's hard for you too. Silas Mead rode down off the rimrock for the last time, and within 3 years his great overreaching outfit had failed and been broken up and sold off in pieces. And one of those pieces, the good bottom land along the creek, was bought at auction by the Gage and Doyle partnership, which by then had the money to buy it, and Hattie stood on land that had once belonged to the most powerful man in the county and felt the particular quiet of a wheel come all the way around. The valley did not call her the bad luck widow anymore. It did not call her poor Doyle's leftover wife. The men who had turned their backs on her in the Grange Hall tipped their hats to her on the street now, careful and respectful, and Walt Hensley, whose cattle had drunk free at her spring through 2 dry summers, could not quite meet her eyes when he thanked her, remembering, as she remembered, the harvest social and the arithmetic behind his eyes and the way he danced off to the Pruitt girl. Hattie never once threw it in his face. She didn't have to. They both knew. That was enough. The all-season spring up on the high bench got a name over those years, the way places do, and the name was not Gage, and it was not Rimrock. The teamsters and the surveyors and the folks in town came to call it Doyle Spring, after the woman who had held it against Silas Mead's riders alone in a blizzard, and when the county came at last to draw its proper maps, that was the name the mapmaker wrote, because it was the name everyone already used. Doyle, her name. The name she'd come west with and been widowed into and been rejected for, written now across the high country in the one place that mattered, the place with the water, the place she had held. She thought about that sometimes, in the years that came after, standing at the south window in the evening, looking down at the valley lights. Gage would come and stand beside her, not behind her, beside her, which was where he had stood since the night he crossed the Grange Hall floor, and they would look at the country they had made theirs out of hard rock and hard weather, and the stubbornness of 2 people who had each spent too long alone. You ever think about that night? He asked her once. The social, the 7 of them. Sometimes she was quiet a moment, not with any bitterness anymore. It's a strange thing, Elias, if even one of those 7 men had chosen me, I'd have gone off to some soft valley farm and been grateful for it my whole life, and I'd have died, never once knowing what I was made of. It took every one of them turning away to send me up this mountain. It took being wanted by nobody to find out I could hold a thing that everybody wanted. She shook her head slowly. The town thinks the mountain saved me. Or that you did. They tell it that way. The storm and the gunman who chose the widow, nobody would have. But that's not the shape of it, and you know it better than anybody. Tell me the shape of it, Gage said, though he knew. Nobody saved me, Hattie said. You didn't rescue me, and the mountain didn't, and no man ever will. You saw me. That's a different thing, and it's the only thing that was ever any use to me. You looked across a room full of people who'd decided exactly what I was worth, and you saw something they all missed, and then you had the plain good sense to get out of the way and let me become it. She turned from the window and looked at her hard-scarred husband in the firelight. The rest I did myself, up here, with my own 2 hands, and I'd not trade one cold day of it for all the soft valleys in the world. Below them, the lights of the town that had thrown her away made small gold points in the dark, and up on the high bench the spring that bore her name ran on cold and clear and unafraid, and the mountain held its long silence around them, the old indifferent silence that had stopped feeling like an enemy a long time ago and had become instead something almost like company. 7 men had looked Hattie Doyle over on a cold night and walked away. and in walking away, they had done her the one great accidental kindness of her life. They had left her for the mountain, and the mountain had asked her for everything she had, and she had found, when it came to it, that everything she had was enough. If Hattie's story stayed with you tonight, then stay with us here at Old West Legends, where the hard tales of the frontier still have something true to say about being overlooked and being underestimated, and about the particular strength that only ever gets forged in the coldest, loneliest ground. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you'd have had the nerve to climb that mountain in her place. And if you believe, as she did, that the ones the world walks past are so often the ones with the most iron in their spine, then pull up a chair by the fire and ride with us a while. There are more legends waiting,